the Heinkel HE-162 Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, unless you're the actual Heinkel firm, in which case they would have called it Spatz, or Sparrow, which I think is an actually much better name, was a German single-engine jet-powered fighter aircraft that was fielded by the Luftwaffe in very, very late in World War II. Now, the Sparrow gets a lot of flack for being bad. A lot of articles paint it as an exceedingly dangerous aircraft that was more likely to kill its own pilot rather than do anything helpful for the German war effort, but in reality, well, they weren't that terrible. Like, genuinely. And I mean that. I've gone on record before defending them, and I admit I'm a little bit biased as they are one of my favorite aircraft due to their unique characteristics. And yes, there were some elements that made them a bit dangerous, but this was more because of the nature of the construction process at the time in Germany, rather than anything to do with the actual design. They had a crew of 1, a length of 29 feet 8 inches, a wingspan of 23 feet 7 inches, a height of 8 feet 6 inches, and a maximum takeoff weight of 6,173 pounds, so they're on the lighter side. Their fuel capacity was only 184 US gallons. They could not carry much fuel at all, and they were powered by a single BMW 109003E1 or a BMW 109003E2 turbojet engine, capable of delivering 1,760 pounds of thrust. They could hit a maximum speed of 520 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, had a service ceiling of 39,000 feet, but only at a range of 606 miles. They were armed with either two 20mm MG-151/20 autocannons or two 30mm MK-108 cannons. They were interesting aircraft, to say the least, but again, they have a very bad reputation that, for the most part, isn't completely deserved. They're overhated, and I'll try to explain why. In order to understand the nature of the 162, we first have to understand the nature of war-torn Germany. At the time, things weren't very good at all. They were on the defensive, harshly. Allied forces were pushing in from all directions, and they really didn't have an answer to deal with any of this. One of their biggest problems were Allied bombing raids, which had destroyed much of their infrastructure. They'd also lost a lot of fighters, both to bombers' defensive guns as well as fighter escorts. The Germans then started trying to use heavier weapons that could attack from a longer range, outside of the defensive envelope of the bombers, which helped a little bit, but this did not help with the P-51 Mustangs. These escort fighters were not only incredibly capable, but could also follow the bombers the entire way, and provide a very fierce defense. And the thing about using those heavier weapons to get at the bombers was, while they worked, they also weighed down a lot of the Luftwaffe's aircraft, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190s, which had also been given extra armor to protect them from bomber defenses. This meant that they actually couldn't outmaneuver the Mustangs, and the Luftwaffe then had to change tactics again, forming up directly in front of the bombers and making single passes through the formations, giving the defenders little time to react, but also not really giving themselves much time to attack either. Then, Major General Jimmy Doolittle, yes, the same Doolittle from the Doolittle Raids, who was the commander of the 8th Air Force at the time, changed policies in January of 1944. He thought that it might be better, instead of forcing the escorts to stay with the bomber formations, allow them free rein to fly ahead and hit Luftwaffe's defensive fighters wherever they could be found, often while they were still on the ground and unable to get into the air in the first place. This more aggressive tactic was actually really effective, and resulted in the Luftwaffe suffering serious losses, irreplaceable, in fact, due to their damaged infrastructure. Many of their aircraft were completely destroyed before they ever had a chance to even fight a bomber. And it wasn't just aircraft, they lost a lot of their pilots too, and they couldn't train new pilots quickly enough to fix this problem. The summer of 1944 shows a significant downturn in Luftwaffe defensive tactics, as they just didn't have planes or people to do it. And without a serious need to defend the bombers, the Allied fighters went absolutely nuts looking for anything to blow up. Air bases, railways, trucks, it didn't matter. Anything that could affect German industry was fair game, and logistics was a serious problem for the Luftwaffe. Maintaining their aircraft was impossible, and getting enough fuel was much more difficult, and they were hard-pressed to do much about it. But some people did offer solutions, and there were two championed opinions, though they both were looking for the immediate introduction of large numbers of jet fighter aircraft. One of the groups was led by General Adolf Galland, who was the inspector of fighters. He felt that superior numbers could only be countered with superior technology, so he wanted every possible effort thrown into increasing production of the Me-262s, even if that meant reducing production of other aircraft. The other group felt that this wouldn't help, though. For whether the Me-262 wasn't perfect, they used Jumo 004 jet engines which were notorious for unreliability, and their landing gear was flawed. Plus, given the logistical problems they were experiencing, even if they upped production, it really only meant that more of them would be sitting on the ground waiting for parts they needed, and then being destroyed, inevitably. Really wasn't going to help. So, while they still wanted a jet, they thought a new design might be a better option, one that was much more inexpensive. So cheap, in fact, that it could simply be thrown out and replaced with a fresh plane straight off assembly line, because that would actually be more cost-effective. The concept of the throwaway fighter. Now already, this sounds ridiculous, but on paper it probably made sense to them at the time. But Galland and several other Luftwaffe senior officers were really against the light fighter concept. They thought it was absurd. But the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer actually did like the idea. Göring and Speer had way more influence, and a contract tender was issued for a single-engine jet fighter that was suited for cheap and rapid mass production. The original parameters were looking for a single-seat fighter, going to be powered by a BMW 003 turbojet. That particular engine was a little lower thrust, and as a result not utilized for the Me-262s or the Arado AR-234 jet bombers. The main structure for these new fighters would use cheap and unsophisticated parts, made of things like wood and other non-strategic materials. They should also be so easy to put together that they could be assembled by semi or even non-skilled labor, including slave labor because this is World War II Germany. And making a plane out of wood isn't unheard of. I mean, there's the Mosquito, the wooden wonder. That was a great aircraft. But this is a jet. And wood is great and all, but in a jet, I don't know about that idea. They also specified multiple performance requirements, like a maximum weight of 4,400 pounds, a maximum speed of 470 miles per hour at sea level, operational endurance that lasted at least a half hour, and takeoff distance could be no greater than 1,640 feet. They did provide provisions for armor plating in areas around the fuel tanks and around the pilot, but suspiciously, the manufacturers were asked to provide details on the aircraft's performance both with and without the armor installed. So, you know where this is probably going. But perhaps most importantly, this plane also had to be easy to fly. Remember, on top of materials, they were having pilot issues, and they were looking for a plane that should be so simple to deal with that even glider or student pilots could handle it effectively in combat. For what it is worth, Ernst Heinkel himself thought this was absolutely ridiculous. For one thing, obviously, no matter how simple and easy to fly you make a plane, the people still have to learn. It's a plane. In this context, you can only make the machine so simple, but there is still a learning curve. Yeah, certain cars are pretty easy to handle too. You still have to learn to drive. You can't just throw anyone in there and be like, alright, go, and this is a fighter aircraft. These people were going to be shooting at other people, in other planes. Many of them were way more skilled in said planes. It is not logically reasonable to design a plane with the intention of a rookie flying it and expect them to perform at the level of an ace. After the war, Heinkel would say that the unrealistic notion that this plane should be a people's fighter in which the Hitler Youth, after a short training regimen with clipped-wing two-seater gliders, like the DFS Stummel Habicht, could fly for the defense of Germany, displayed the unbalanced fanaticism of those days. For reference, the Habicht gliders had varying wingspans, and were originally used to prepare more experienced Luftwaffe pilots to fly the Me-163B Comets, which were also notoriously dangerous, and they were going to use them for the Volksjäger. which, I mean, it's nice they're giving them some training, but still, I don't think you're really thinking this through. This reeks of desperation is where we're at with it. The requirement was issued to the industry on September 8th, 1944, and bidders would be required to submit their basic designs within 10 days, while quantity production of the aircraft was to commence by January 1st, 1945. It may seem weird for me to tell you that nearly every German aircraft manufacturer expressed interest in the project, but while they knew it was a tall order, the winner of it would be building huge numbers of these planes, and therefore making more money, so naturally everyone wanted to get involved. But Heinkel had secretly had a head start. They'd been working on a series of paper projects for light twin-engined fighters over the previous year, under the designation P.1073. They'd gone so far as to build and test several models, and conduct some wind tunnel tests. Due to this factor, Heinkel's submission was accepted, and looking at the P.1073, you can certainly see its influence on the 162. They just changed the tail structure and dropped that lower engine off. Otherwise, it's basically the same plane. But even with the pre-existing design work, what the Luftwaffe wanted was still a complete pain in the butt. They had to simplify this thing quite a bit. Not only did they remove the lower engine, but they also moved the top engine forward slightly to better balance the aircraft. But one consequence was that the jet exhaust would pass directly over the upper rear fuselage, as well as the tail area, which is why they widened the tail, giving it two small vertical stabilizers positioned to either side. The horizontal stabilizer was also set at a dihedral of 14 degrees, to raise the vertical stabilizers in line with the wing. The wing itself was mounted fairly high on the fuselage, and attached using only 4 bolts. One of the major flaws with this setup was the fact that the engine intake was right behind where the pilot is, and many articles point out how if someone tried to bail out they could get sucked in, which is true. Which is why, from the very beginning, Heinkel actually designed the 162 to feature an ejection seat, similar to the one they incorporated in the Heinkel HE-219 Night Fighter. The landing gear was a tricycle layout, and Heinkel had significant previous experience with that, though this was the first design they had made to use that layout from the very beginning. The pilot could check to see whether the gear was down through a small window in the lower part of the cockpit between the rudder pedals, and some of the gearing components they used were actually recycled from other German military aircraft. The prototype for the Volksjäger took off really fast, like really fast. The design had only been selected on September 25th, 1944, but she first flew on December 6th of the same year, just a few months. In a way, it kinda helped sell the plane to the Luftwaffe, since Heinkel had put it together very quickly. And this was still done despite the fact that the factory over in Wuppertal that had been making Telgo film plywood glue, which had been used in a lot of late-war German aviation designs, particularly ones that involved wood, had actually been bombed by the Royal Air Force, and therefore they were running out of that glue. Instead, they used a substitute glue, which did seem to work, but they did not realize that the replacement was very, very, very acidic, and it would, of course, inevitably disintegrate the wooden parts it was intended to be holding together. You see how this is not going well already, but they didn't know that at the time. The maiden flight of the V-1 went alright, but during a high-speed run hitting 520 miles per hour, the glue issue came up. The nose gear strut door failed, but the pilot was able to land. They also noticed there was some pitch instability and problems with side slip due to the rudder's design. And none of those were considered important enough to hold up production schedule for even one more day. Sir, shouldn't we wait and try to design a fighter that actually works? We asked the questions! On the second flight on December 10th, in front of various officials, the glue again caused another structural failure. This time, the aileron separated from the wing, which is way worse than a nose gear strut door failing. This caused the plane to roll over, break up in the air, and crash, which killed the pilot, Gotthold Peter. An investigation showed that the wing's structure had to be strengthened, and some redesign was needed. Really? Why? They wanted to try to avoid using the glue since it was obvious that it was defective. And by defective, I mean it was literally eating the plane! But the schedule was so tight that testing was forced to continue with the current design. While the engineers scrambled in the background to fix the issues, they still continued testing the second prototype, which first flew on December 22nd. In that case, the stability problems were actually a lot worse. particularly the aircraft's tendency to Dutch roll. They did realize it could easily be solved by reducing the dihedral, but the 162 was supposed to enter production within weeks, so there was no time to implement major design changes. So a number of small band-aids were put on the design instead, such as the addition of lead ballast in the nose to move the center of gravity towards the front of the aircraft. Yes, they weighed down the nose to fix it instead of, fixing the tail. Like, really? That was your plan? Okay. The tail surfaces were also slightly increased in size, but those measures didn't really help much, and experienced individuals like Alexander Lippitt felt that the flying characteristics of the plane were unsuitable for inexperienced pilots, which, if you remember, was like the whole point? So, yeah. The third and fourth prototypes flew in mid-January of 1945, and they had been fitted with strengthened wings, as well as small anhedral aluminum drooped wing tips. This was another attempt to help with the stability problems, by decreasing the main wing panel's marked 3-degree dihedral angle. These prototypes were also equipped with actual cannons, but when those weapons were tested, the recoil from those guns was way too much for the lightweight fuselage to handle. They were using 30mm Mk108s. As such, they pushed for the A2 model of the 162, which used two 20mm cannons instead, which wouldn't have as bad of recoil, though they still wanted the A3 version, and redesign work went into strengthening the plane to handle the recoil of the larger guns. And utilizing inexperienced pilots to fly these never really panned out in any real way. While the Volksjäger was built with the intention of being flown by Hitler Youth, they wound up way too complicated, and could only be handled by experienced pilots. Just as Lippitt has said, there was only ever one HE-162 Hitler Youth training unit activated, in March of 1945 at an airbase at Zegen, but they were still forming when the war ended, and didn't begin any training at all. In January of 1945, the Luftwaffe did form Test Unit 162, which was an evaluation group, to which the first 46 HE-162s were sent. They were based on the Luftwaffe's main testing grounds, in Rechlin. In February, deliveries of the aircraft commenced to the first operational unit, the 1st Fighter Wing, which had previously flown Focke-Wulf 190As. But these attempted deliveries and training and everything was happening well in the middle of constant Allied air attacks, so getting really anyone trained in the 162 was nearly impossible, but some did take to the air and saw combat. The first time this happened was in mid-April 1945, yes, that late. On April 19th, Gunther Kirchner shot down a Royal Air Force fighter in his HE-162. Initially, that victory was actually credited to flak, but the British pilot confirmed that no, it was that weird jet thing. What the heck was that? Though Kirchner was not around to enjoy being the first one to get a kill in this thing, as he was shot down the same day over Husum by Flying Officer Geoffrey Walkington, who was in a Hawker Tempest. The 162s did get a few more kills, but they would suffer 13 losses, including 10 pilots. 10 of those losses were actually not due to enemy action. They were due to things like flameouts from the engines, or random structural failures because acidic glue. And one of the 162's largest problems was flight time. They had basically no endurance, they could only fly for 30 minutes. At least 2 pilots were killed attempting emergency dead stick landings. 30 minutes is still better than the Comet 7, but it's still only 30 minutes, a half hour. What are you doing? The ejection seat was incorporated, though, and it was employed by pilots at least 4 times. Kirchner actually had been the first to use it, and it probably would have saved his life, but he was too low at the time, and he was killed when his parachute failed to open. The second 2 uses of it actually seemed to work, though the last use didn't go so well. The pilot ejected on April 24th, but the cockpit canopy failed to detach. That was pretty much the extent of the service life. The war was almost over when they got involved. They didn't have time to do much of anything of note, and they were never gonna solve Germany's problems. It was over. Many of the planes were surrendered to Allied forces, who took them back to their respective countries for evaluation. And based off everything I've told you, it sounds like they were pretty terrible, but no. No, because when they were evaluated, and when their construction was solidified, it was found that, from a design perspective, they were actually really good. Genuinely so. I'm not making this up. The difficulties experienced to them are believed to have primarily been a result of their rushing to get them introduced, not any inherent design flaw with them. An experienced Luftwaffe pilot who did fly the 162 felt it was a first-class combat aircraft, and the legendary Eric Brown of the Fleet Air Arm, who you may recognize as flying more different types of aircraft than literally anyone else in history, also counted the Sparrow among those aircraft. And he said that it had the lightest and most effective aerodynamically balanced controls he had ever experienced. He felt the plane was actually quite excellent, though he did acknowledge that one should treat the rudder with some suspicion due to a number of in-flight failures, likely due to the rush production issues. Again, the actual design of the aircraft, the shape, the aerodynamics is genuinely good. People tend to hate on it because of the construction issues, but that's to do with war-torn Germany rushing things, not due to Heinkel actually designing a bad plane. On its own, when built out of proper materials, and with the level of care and precision proper aircraft manufacturing should have, the Sparrow is actually a great jet. There's at least 8 that made it into preservation, and even 1 reproduction, as displayed at the National Warplane Museum in New York. And I gotta be honest, I really like these little things. They're cute. They were just built too quickly, and made for the wrong purpose. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Row Videos, Lord Off 444, Royal Hunter 2060, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Lindsay, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Revel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, Hannah Bird, No, Eric Hutton, Kirk Forcum, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Race 78, Nylon, AET Museum, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, Liam Wright, DM Trouble Typhoon, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, the Habitual of Fun. Farewell.